Legend of Total War here, and today we're doing another top 5 Total War video. This time I'm covering the top 5 most fragile factions in a Total War game. So these are the factions which, when controlled by the AI, tend to never reach their full potential, or end up dying before the player even meets them, or dying very early on in the game. Not in every single campaign that you'll play, but in most of the campaigns that I've played so far on these games, these factions rarely see the light of day. So let's now move on to number 5. Coming in at number 5 is Portugal for Medieval 2 Total War. Now, in the campaigns that I've played, I very rarely see Portugal do anything, and oftentimes they're destroyed before I even get to them. And the primary reason for that, I think, is their fragmented starting position. Now, I'm not trying to sit here and say that Portugal is a weak faction. They have a lot of potential, but most of the time with the potential, the player will be needed to harness it. The AI, on the other hand, has a really difficult time with this faction because it's a difficult faction to control to begin with, largely due to the fragmentation. Having one region over here in Lisbon and another here in Pamplona, there is a large distance between these two areas. Now, other factions in this game, in fact, all other factions have their territories either close together, so it's easy to defend them, or they're small or far away. For example, Russia, they're far away from anyone that can attack them in the early game, giving them time to set up. And also, invading Russia is a pain, and it's not worth it in the early game anyway. Whereas this is relatively valuable territory. If France wanted to come down here early on and attack Pamplona, any reinforcements from Lisbon would simply take too long to get there. Alternatively, if the Moors wanted to attack Lisbon, any reinforcements from Pamplona would take too long to get there. So really an aggressive playstyle is needed to really harness the full potential of Portugal, and the AI in this game tends not to be particularly aggressive. And even if it was, it starts off next to 3 of the strongest factions in the game that are stronger than them, at least to begin with. In addition to that, their economy is one of the weakest in the early game, having a deficit right off the bat. Now, you can fix that right away, and the AI will get cheats so that they don't go broke. But other factions don't have those problems, especially the ones on their border. And so, in an area where they're surrounded by particularly strong players, Portugal tends to die pretty early, especially when controlled by the AI. In Medieval 2 Total War, I have received more Portugal campaign, SYDC campaigns, so 7-year disaster campaigns, than any other faction. So, just on the law of averages, it seems that most players have the biggest trouble playing as Portugal in this game. And that's why they're getting the number 5 slot for the most fragile faction, at least in this game. So let's now move on to number 4. Coming in at number 4 is the Eastern Roman Empire in Total War Attila. Now, a strong case can certainly be made for the Western Roman Empire to instead take this slot. And I'm sure a lot of people will be like, why not the West? And maybe some of you will be thinking, oh, maybe the West is further up on this list. Well, I can promise you now that the Western Roman Empire is not on this list at all. And I'll just briefly explain why. The Western Roman Empire is about as powerful as a wet noodle in this game, whereas the Eastern Roman Empire is arguably one of the richest, most powerful, strongest factions in this game. There's a huge difference between the potential of the Eastern Roman Empire and the West. Historically speaking, the West fell in this time period, and the East remained pretty much intact. So that's why the East is getting the spot on the list, because it's not supposed to fall apart. And in every single campaign that I've ever played in Total War Attila, unless I'm playing the Eastern Roman Empire, the East falls to pieces, pretty much about the same rate as the Western Roman Empire falls apart, making them extremely fragile. So what is it exactly that makes them so fragile? Well, it really just comes down to the fact that they have too many enemies. At the beginning of the campaign, they have a horde faction of the Visigoths already in their territory. The Ostrogoths and Gepids are usually a huge problem. The Huns, they're usually the first target of the Huns. And even though they start off with a non-aggression pact with the Sassanids, that usually doesn't last very long. And once you're at war with the Sassanids, you're also at war with all of their vassals, and the vassal swarm can be a serious pain in the ass to deal with. Now, that's just dealing with the northern part of the empire. Then there's the southern part. You've got the Garamantians over here. They're almost guaranteed to declare war on the west. and by extension you, unless you want to break your alliance with the West. And then there's, well, that's if the AI does it, that is. And then there's Axum, which they've got nowhere else to go but into the Eastern Roman Empire. So by having all of these factors compound on them all at once before they really get a chance to access the full potential of their economy and the full potential of their best units, the Eastern Roman Empire is usually reduced to a couple of settlements in the Mediterranean. Usually the last bastions of the Eastern Roman Empire remain Gotinia, Rhodes, or Constantia, just because the AI is not particularly good at naval invasions in this game. And so they usually screw that up a fair bit. But usually the rest of these settlements are gone pretty early on, and that's why the Eastern Roman Empire is getting the spot on the list. Let's now move on to number 3. Coming in at number 3 is Rome in Total War Rome 2. Now, this faction is arguably the strongest in the game. It has the best armies, the best economy, it's got the best of everything, except for one thing, and that one thing is what causes its downfall. Now, when the player's in control of it, it's not really that big of a deal, but this list is more about when the AI controls it, what causes them to fall apart. So in most of the campaigns that I've played in Rome 2, when not playing as Rome, which, to be honest, most of the time I am playing as Rome, but when I'm not, Rome ends up falling to the AI. They don't usually see Rome get too big. Doesn't always happen, sometimes they do, but they usually end up collapsing. And this one reason is the reason for it. It's because of their culture, Latin culture. They only share Latin culture affinity with one other faction, and that's the Etruscan League, and they start off as mortal enemies. So they're basically isolated right from the start. Every other culture in the game has more subsequent factions that they share it with. Even the very limited Balkan factions have more affinity with each other than anything to do with the Latin culture. It's so isolated and surrounded by much bigger cultures that diplomatically it causes them to be in a really tough position right at the start. Also, Italy is not particularly easy to defend. It's very susceptible to invasions from multiple frontiers. So what ends up happening is Rome expands a little bit, it meets a bunch of barbarians, and because nobody likes Latin culture, they just say right off the bat, fuck Rome. These guys up here, the Helvetii, the Raeti, and Nori, they're all allied with each other. So if Rome manages to break into here, then they've got to contend with these guys here, and invading this area here is very difficult. But invading via here is actually quite easy. In addition to that, Epirus usually attacks pretty early on, and they're just one turn away from hitting Brundisium. And then there's also Carthage. So the player can certainly handle this situation, but the AI doesn't know what to do, and they usually get absolutely gangbanged by other cultures that just quite frankly hate the Latins, and that's why Rome gets the 3rd spot on this list. Let's now move on to number 2. Taking the number 2 slot goes to France in Empire Total War. Now, once again, this is a very powerful faction. It has a hell of a lot of potential. Paris is arguably the richest region in the game. I think it has one of the highest potential for population and has an absolute shitload of potential buildings, allowing it to accumulate a hell of a lot of money. It's also got a lot of territory to begin with in the New World, giving itself, a good holding out here from which to import quite a bit of furs, sugar, all of those resources, which can yield quite a bit of trade resources. So what is it about France that makes them so fragile? Because don't forget, this list is not about weakest factions. This is about the fragile factions. Factions that are perhaps potentially strong, but can die on a whim. Well, that's the thing about Paris. It's its greatest strength, but also its greatest weakness. Now, France usually loses Alsace-Lorraine pretty early on, because it's not that easy to defend, and the Germans kind of want it pretty early on. So either Spain, Netherlands, one of the Holy Roman Empire dudes, Württemberg, they usually want to take that pretty early on. And if that does happen, if they lose Paris, it's game over. Because in Empire Total War, it doesn't matter how many territories that you've got overseas, if a European faction loses its territory in its home theater, they lose the game. And that's exactly what ends up happening to France. In fact, it's so fragile that as England, you can actually destroy France as a faction on turn 1 by basically duping them into giving you Alsace-Lorraine, which is very easy to do, which you could do with any faction, really, so you don't have to do this with England. It's just that England is the closest to Paris. And then with your starting army, you just march down on Paris, which is a difficult fight, but if you win it, that's it. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, France. It's game over for them, and that's it. They're fragile. Gone on turn 1, 2, 3, usually pretty early on. Now, it doesn't always happen, but it can happen, and it's very bad for France if it does, obviously. And that's why they're getting the number 2 slot, an extremely fragile faction. Now let's move on to the most fragile faction in a Total War game. Coming in at number 1 for the most fragile faction in a Total War game goes to the von Carsteins in Total War Warhammer 1 and 2. So that's Vlad von Carstein here. Now, this is particularly ironic because Vlad in the lore is one of the most unkillable, immortal characters that ever existed. The amount of times that he was defeated, killed, and brought back to life is pretty hilarious, actually. Now, in Total War Warhammer 1 and 2, his faction is so brittle that I very rarely see him live to turn 50. Now, the funny thing is that I usually take it as a priority to engage with the von Carsteins fairly early on. So I don't exactly try to avoid them. I try to get over to them. Whichever faction I play as, I try to get over to them. Not to eliminate them, but to fight Isabella von Carstein for the amazing trait that she provides. But in most of my campaigns that I've played recently, by the time I get here, the von Carsteins are already gone. The AI has already stomped them out of existence. Whether it have been Manfred already just not annexing him, that just never happens. I meant like they conquer him, or Sterling goes in and conquers him, or even Tempelhof goes in and conquers him, or the dwarves come in and conquer them, because he's only got a minor settlement that's not walled, and the potential for him to recruit amazing armies to defend it is pretty low, whereas everybody else has a lot of potential. So it's a very difficult settlement for him to defend. Now, as the player, you're probably not going to get wiped out because it is a strong faction. But the AI, in most of the campaigns that I've played in recent memory, just stomp out the von Carsteins before I get a chance to have my way with Isabella, which is very unfortunate. And I believe that this can have a very, very easy solution, which they have already going for Musalon in Bretonnia, which is to provide Schwarzhafen with a building, a unique building that's like a landmark that actually gives it walls, much in the same way as Musalon. If that happened, I believed that von Carstein would at least survive most of the campaign until the player at least got to them most of the time. There's no guarantee with any faction that they're ever going to survive, but when it comes to the von Carsteins, they are pretty much guaranteed to die, no matter what happens, no matter what you do, unless you make it your absolute mission to save Vlad very early on, because you don't have much time before someone decides, you know what, I've had enough of Vlad, let's just go conquer him. And that's what makes him the most brittle, fragile faction in the Total War franchise, and that's why he got the number 1 slot. Anyway, that's the end of this video. Let me know what you think, whether or not you thought there was something that should have been on the list or something that shouldn't have been on the list. And if you haven't already, check out another one of the top 5 videos. I'll leave some links up here on the title screen, and we'll see you next time, fuckers.